Hi everyone, this is Station Frederick. I am just waiting for Thea to join in, and then we will start the webinar promptly at 2 p.m. Hi Larissa, thank you for joining. I'm just waiting for our guest to come in at 2 p.m. Actually, she is here, so I'm here.
Hey,
How are you?
good. How are you?
Good.
How's the connection? Is it okay?
I'm still getting the echo.
Okay. Let me just try my headphones here.
Okay.
Is that better?
That is way better.
Oh, it's my phone.
Okay.
So it's my phone and not my shitty internet.
No.
I'm gonna try to figure out how to like stand this up because like I've got that new phone where like you have to have the little dongle that attaches to like the phone cord or the headphones.
Okay,
Anyways.
right. And it's at the bottom.
And it's at the bottom, so I can't stand it up. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. No. Figuring technology out.
Yeah, I'm just gonna try to figure out a way to get this to sit here.
So hi, Justin. So Tia, are you able to see the comments below?
There we go. Wait, is that good?
It's perfect.
I hope it doesn't fall over. Apologies if it does.
Okay.
I think I can. Wait, hold on. I can see people. Oh my God, there it is. Okay.
Lovely. So we will, at the end of our little chat, people may have a few questions.
Yeah.
And so we will be able to sort of go through those questions. So the time is 2 p.m. and I am very much conscientious of people's time. And so I definitely would like to begin, of course, for those who are on. And hi, Audrey, for coming on board on the live. We will be starting now. Once Tia, are you set?
I think so.
Okay. Awesome. And so, of course, Tia, thank you for taking the time to chat with me and to be on this live chat with many who have joined. Just in terms of setting this conversation, I have asked for all those who are online that Tia do an acknowledgement of the land and of the resources. So Tia, if you would do that, please, and then I will sort of get into I guess all parts are formal, but get into more bios and then into the questions.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll just start off by introducing myself, and I can only speak for the land that I'm on right now. So, Ani Bojo, hi everybody. Thank you for spending some time with us. My name is Thea Belanger, and I'm Ojibwe Maliseet, member of Nipissing First Nation in Ontario. I live, work, and play on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory in the city of Ottawa. And I actually work from my house, so you're seeing all my own stuff behind me. And I'm also the project director for the Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Project, which from a very top level is a small granting fund for Indigenous youth in Ontario. And we provide small grants in the realm of $5,000 to young people doing good work in their communities.
Right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Tia. I did have your bio that you sent, but you basically, gave that introduction. So thank you very much for that. But just, of course, you did let me know that you've been part of the philanthropic sector for the past 10 years, but always rooted in community, and that's just talking that your family have come from various creatives and activists and whatnot, and so it's amazing for you to be on this call. And again, with such short notice, I'm just very humbled that you will take the time off to speak to all on this live. So again, thank you.
Oh, me, Gretch. I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully I provide something. Get a conversation started.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so for those on the call, my name is Station Frederick, and I am part of the fellowship with the Association of Fundraising Professionals in Inclusion and Philanthropy. I'm the executive director of a youth center here in Toronto. I lived in Ottawa for about 6 years, in which I also started an organization called Braids for AIDS that I've been running for quite a long time. And from before that, I lived in Trinidad. Well, I am from Trinidad and Tobago, and so I have traveled many lands, but currently here in Toronto. As part of the Association of Fundraising Professionals Fellowship, it's again around inclusion and philanthropy. And my fellow Fatu, who is on the live right now, but helped in sort of orchestrating all of this and helping to formulate some of the questions. I just wanted to acknowledge her as well. And for all who just joined in online, of course, you could at any point in time, please, provide your questions, and at the end, Tia will be able to respond to this. So Tia, can you give your role in the philanthropic sector? I know you just mentioned about being sort of a project director of the Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnerships Project. So again, if you could talk a little bit more about that, as well as your other roles in the philanthropic sector.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate everybody's patience with me being on live, because I have never done this before. So this is totally new and fresh for me. So if my phone falls over, I apologize. I will try to get that back in working order. But yeah, I mean, I see my role in a few different ways, but I think maybe it might be good if I start back on the beginning and how I actually ended up here.
Right.
So I was actually working on a documentary TV series for APTN back in 2005, 2006. And that was around when the economy crashed. And so a lot of people in Hollywood North lost their jobs. And so I was one of those people. And I survived on a lot of temp work. And I found myself one day at a charitable organization that I ended up being at for several years and working in a lot of different sort of capacities and roles. And so eventually I found my way back to Ottawa. If I didn't mention, this was in Vancouver. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
And I found my way back to Ottawa, where most of my family is. And I found myself in this different sort of world of philanthropy, and that was this Indigenous philanthropic section of the sector. And it was a pretty big hurdle for me, because I had to learn how to sort of conduct myself in a space that leaned very heavily on my Indigenous side, and then also on the experiences and my work experience. And I was coming from a place that did not recognize me as Anishinaabe Kwe, as an Indigenous woman. and nor did I see anybody that looked like me or that was like me within the sector. So it was a really interesting space for me to straddle. And to give a little bit of context, OIP was started through a partnership through the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada and Tides Canada. And I was actually working at the Circle at the time. So I've been part of this project since it sort of came to be way back when. And now I'm doing this full time, which is like a total dream and like blows your mind, right? It's so amazing. But yeah, so that's sort of like how I kind of came to be in this space. But you know, with those experiences of being at the Circle and now running this program that we created together as a small group, I see my role in a couple of ways. And one of those ways is being a sharer, and a share of my own personal experiences of being a young Indigenous woman in the sector, but then also sharing the experiences and learnings of things that we've accomplished with OIP, and using that to equip young people that we work with the right knowledge and tools so that they have a better understanding of what this sector is really sort of about. And then the other piece that I think we kind of have, that I have in my role, is a bit of a protector role. And it's in the same realm of utilizing the learnings and the knowledge that we've gained of working with OIP and using that model over the last few years to help educate our sector, so that when young people are looking to access the sector and looking to access granting funds, they're met with better, more educated people, and who maybe will flip it a little bit and allow them to have a better experience than maybe someone like me has had over the last few years. So I see it being a couple of different ways, and that ties myself to OIP as well as a person.
Right. You know, you talked a bit, and so can you explain some of the ways in which that you support young people in terms of, you know, accessing, you know, funds in this philanthropic sector?
Yeah, I mean, like through OIP, you know, OIP was created by and for Indigenous young people. So everything in terms of how we operate and what we do in terms of support was created by the lived experiences of other young people of trying to access the sector. So we try to cater the types of ways that we support young people in the ways that they need it. So it's not pre-prescribed. It's not done in a way that's like, this should work for everybody, but it's like, that shit doesn't work for everybody. So why would we do that? Like, if this person only needs to like talk to me about getting a letter of support, and then this other project maybe needs to talk to me once a week to chat things out, needs some help, just like, you know, bouncing ideas off of, like, being able to cater and be flexible in terms of how we provide things based on the needs that people express, I think is a lot different than what I've ever experienced within the sector in the last few years. So
right. No, and you know, as I listen to you speak, it sounds about really sort of meeting people where they're at, and providing more than just providing funds for young people, but also looking at what are the additional supports that they might need. So a sort of capacity building. I don't want to use you know, all these jargons, but really just sort of about, I mean, just supporting people.
Right. Like, I see it as being like being able to talk with and chat with your aunties or your cousins about certain things, right? Like, that you tend to get knowledge from and support from in the same way, but we're just implementing it in a different space, right? And providing, and the language that we're using too is a lot different than a lot of programs that we see out there. So it's intentional. All of these pieces are very much intentional, and we change them all the time based on what's going on and what's happening in the world and what's happening in Indian country and what's happening in community. and trying to make sure that we're being as reflective and responsive and acknowledging what's going on. I think that goes a long way.
Right, right. So, I mean, I know I have a flow of questions, but as you talk, there's so much more. So, how do you keep grounded, and how in what's going on with these young people? How do you maintain that sort of understanding?
I mean, I think it's a lot through the teams that we built within OIP. So like we're in this right now. We're in, and I feel like we've always been in like a constant state of like transition, but this is like a particularly large year where, you know, we've received a YOF grant that's allowed me to be full-time and also bring on a coordinator position. But we're also coming into a space of like, what do we want to be utilizing this model to do? And I think that's a really big piece. And so trying to lean in and work with people who are from community and being conscious of bringing those people into the space is part of that. You know, the coordinator we hired is a former grantee of OIP from the first 2 years.
Nice.
And we just work really well together, and she's, what a beautiful spirit. And so I'm so grateful to have that person, and it, like, having that kind of like connection back and being able to like, we're learning to, it's not perfect, but we're continuing to learn on how do we continue to foster those relationships that we've had over the past few years and continue to push them forward. So, you know, we have 2 new advisors that are from, one of them is from a grantee from last year. And like the excitement that people have coming in when they see the type of work that you're trying to do and the way that you're doing it, it sparks a lot of excitement.
Right. No, that's beautiful. And I think there's so much to learn from a model that sort of engages community in the process. What is the meaning of philanthropy to you?
So I've been thinking about all these questions, right? And you know, from an Indigenous perspective, let me just put this out here first. I'm on my learning journey. I'm on my own journey of learning and unlearning a lot of things. And I'm uncovering some very profound and moving things about who I am and what I connect back to. So the way that I'm connecting this kind of question is really something about philanthropy being ingrained into who we are as human beings from an Indigenous perspective. So it's not just about this love for humanity, but it's something that is deeply rooted in your culture and in your language. And it's not something that you were ever asked about or rewarded for or recognized for, but something that you were always taught to do and be as you relate to community and land and family. And so I think it's really interesting to me that if within Indigenous language, you'll find that there aren't words for certain things because they weren't needed. So there's words that we have in the English language that describe a lot of traumatic things that don't exist in Indigenous language because we never needed them, because they were so deeply ingrained into who we were and brought to be and related to each other that we didn't need to have things that described acts in violent ways. And so I think that really connects back to this, like, what does philanthropy mean to me? So it's like, I think that's what philanthropy wishes it was, and maybe sometimes thinks it's doing and pretends to be that, but it's like totally not. But it's something that's very profound to me to like think about the fact that like that I come across a lot of situations where people don't understand what I'm talking about, but for some reason I know, and like my cousins around me, and my cousins, I mean like my coworkers, my other Indigenous coworkers that I work with, you know, they all understand me too without really having to say it, but when I'm speaking to, you know, some non-Indigenous folks about some of these things, there's like this disconnect. I'm like, how do you not understand what I'm talking about? And I'm like, and I don't have any other words to describe it. So, you know, it's one of those things I'm connecting these pieces back, and it's really incredible. So
right. And I hear that, you know, piece, because there's sometimes you know, you're struggling for words, and it's just a way of being, a way of existing. And so it's very, you know, difficult to sort of relate and share, but you feel it in your bones, you feel it in your heart, you feel it in your spirit. It's just something. And I think when you're connected to community, land, resources, or whatnot, and that's just part of who you are, then, you know, describing it is quite, you know, difficult. So I appreciate you sharing, you know, that. And so, you know, what needs to be done to support the inclusivity of Indigenous communities and accessing funds for their issues and causes, and especially thinking of, you know, you saying again, philanthropy is something that is just a way of being, right? How can we support? And so beyond just that piece, but really looking at inclusivity in that.
So I have a few different thoughts about it, and they're not in any like particular order, but just some things that I was thinking about when I'm thinking about what needs to be done. And the first thing I think is that maybe we need to be rethinking the term inclusive and inclusivity. There's something about it that gives off the impression that your table is better than my table, right? And that decision making happens only over here. So you need to come to this table in order for us to give you whatever you need to help your cause or something. And so I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I just want to point that out, that like maybe we need to rethink that a little bit of how we're are or aren't meeting people where they need to be. And then I think the other thing too is that there's a certain element of relinquishing power and money that needs to happen. And I have an example. It's not the perfect example, but it's the only example I've got of this, and that's really the beginning of OIP. So we had a funder that provided a small amount of seed money, and all they said was this was for Indigenous youth in Ontario, and that the work needed to be rooted in community well-being. Okay. And whether that was a decision of like, if that was an intentional thing, or if that was I don't have time and I don't give a shit, so here you go. Neither answers are wrong. I mean, totally fine. But I think it's just an example of why we've been able to be so successful, because we were just here. I have this to give that you need. And then we created something that didn't hold us to anything. It didn't make us have to think about, well, how are we going to report back on this? How are we going to evaluate ourselves? And what is their idea of success? Right? And so it began something that I think a lot of philanthropic organizations can really, really learn from, and how we sort of been able to conduct this and create something that's good. And just as a reminder, you know, like OIP is wonderful in so many ways, but it is not perfect. You know, it still is based off of colonial structures, right? Like we still play the game because we have to, but we still play the game. And so I think that's just an important thing to at least acknowledge, that while it's, in my opinion, one of the best versions of philanthropy and an amazing model that can be learned from, it's still part of a colonial structure. Right.
And so because you said there was none in any particular order, so
I got one last one.
Right, yes.
Hold on, let me take a sip from my giant pickle jar.
Awesome.
Everybody on meetings always laugh at my big jar.
I'm a tea drinker, so we're all yes.
I think one of the last things, and this is going to be like a reoccurring theme in our conversation, and that's about personal journeys, self-reflection, and heart work that I think really needs to be happening, that I don't really know if it is happening quite yet. And that's for, you know, all of the individual Indigenous, non-Indigenous folks working within the sector, of taking some time to personally reflect on how they contribute to, participate in white supremacist systems and white dominated culture.
Yeah.
Because it boggles my mind when I hear and I see organizations creating really great programs and work for Indigenous communities, marginalized communities, but they don't know how they as people participate in this, and that for some reason they can go home and forget about it and then go back to work the next day. It's like, that shit doesn't happen. For me, I work out of my house, but you know, I don't leave this.
Right.
This is part of who I am. And so I think it's important that people recognize that it should be part of who you are as a person too. And it should have an impact on you as a person and in your family and your relationships and how you relate back to the work that you're doing. So, you know, I just think that there's something to be said about being able to provide better support by having better education of how you even just being in a room can affect other people around you, right? So there's just a lot of hard work that I think needs to be happening.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much I, you know, relate to that piece. In you know, I still probably think of it as you know, a trauma in terms of working in environments that, you know, say that getting funding even to do work within the African, Caribbean, and Black community, but even myself as an individual working in that environment, experiencing things of racism and sexism and ageism, you know, at the hands of people who are saying that they're working for the community. And so it's you know, I think one of my fellows said it, you know, really well when we were having another sort of session, and he said, you know, how do you resolve this whole piece around philanthropy and doing good for others, but then we have the same systems oppressing people that we work in. So I think you just again hit on that piece. That is very it resonates a lot to me, and I'm sure to some of other people that will listen to this. So, you know, I thank you for sharing that you know, piece. Did you want to add any more on that, or?
I'm sure it'll come up again.
Absolutely. As you said, that is a resounding, you know, theme, and I think maybe that would tie into some of the other, you know, questions that I have here. How should philanthropy be viewed given the resources which have been taken from marginalized and oppressed communities? And I think earlier on you kind of said it, where a donor just sort of gave money and that was, but again, like maybe if you unpack and talk more about that, how should philanthropy be viewed?
Well, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge the history and the participation that philanthropy has had in the destruction of the attempted destruction of Indigenous communities. And while a lot of that was always well-intentioned, nobody ever really wants to go back and was like, oh shit, I did that. Right. Or my family did that, or like my family foundation is built off of the destruction of resources and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's important for people, let's say new people looking in to access granting dollars, to ask those kinds of questions. You know, are the foundations acknowledging where they've built their wealth and accumulated their wealth? Is there an acknowledgement of that? And then also, what are they doing about it now?
Right.
I think they're really great questions to be asking. I am personally of the opinion that there is no clean money.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to, I think it'd be hard pressed to find a foundation that has clean money or that wasn't built off of resources from the land or off the backs of Indigenous people in Turtle Island. So what are we going to do about it? So it's like, let's have that conversation. And are we going to work with organizations that are willing to acknowledge the destruction and their participation in that? And then what can we be doing to move forward? I think it's, I always think too about that. It like brings me into like a zombie apocalypse. And I'm like, what's the first thing that loses its value when a zombie apocalypse happens? It's money, because you can't eat that, right? Like you can't eat it, it doesn't feed you. So it's like, what are we going to do?
Right.
So it's something that can be utilized to move things forward, and it can bring a lot of good things, but it's like, let's just be a little bit more real about it, and then bring that back to a human space of like, okay, maybe your family foundation did a lot of shitty things in the past, but what are like some of even the young people who are starting to take over these family foundations doing? And are they educating themselves, and are they taking the time to do that hard work? I think they're all things that we need to be asking ourselves, and then, making sure that you're drawing your line where you feel comfortable.
Right.
But yeah, I just don't think that like we're ever going to get away from that. So it's just really about what we're going to try to do to move it all forward.
Right. So many thoughts are going through my mind. First, I just was like, wow, I know Justin from the OTF told me that you're amazing, and I needed to connect with you and have this interview. And as you speak, I understand what he means by that, because such amazing sort of words of wisdom coming out. And I think of, I do grant writing workshops, and I speak especially to young people about when a lot of foundations are now having interviews with potential grantees, right? And I say to people, to these young people, this is not the time for just an interview from the founder interviewing you, but you having those conversations. And so I think absolutely we need to start asking those important questions to funders, even in information sessions or the different spaces that we may interact with funders, of what is their understanding of their accumulation of wealth, and how do we ensure that structures and that seek to exclude individuals from access dismantled. So I just think really good pieces. And again, now that that word around structure came about, it sort of ties perfectly into my next question, which is, what structures exist that limit Indigenous people from engaging in philanthropy? I would say from one, donors. So from that perspective, of the donor perspective, the other perspective as workers in the sector, as organizations or individuals who are accessing funding. So there's, I guess, 4 pieces. So what structures may exist for those different subgroups within the philanthropic sector?
Well, I mean, I think I'll tie this back to, I have one very specific issue that I would actually like to pose to this group as well, that I'll touch on in a second. But I think this really ties back to this is the butt clenching, word here, but the white supremacist culture, right? we could talk all day about very specific things, but if we don't talk about the overarching issue of like the white dominated culture and the work we do to comfort that, we're not going to get anywhere. And we need to be working on figuring out ways to change that narrative and dismantle. So that ties into being donors and working in the sector and as organizations. You know, I think these are all things that we're continually taught that these are the right ways of doing it. And it's like, well, we've been doing this for so long, so why would we change it? But it's like, yo, we got to do something here, because obviously there's things that are not working.
Right.
And we need to change that. So you think that the way that you're doing this is right, but maybe you should take some time to reflect on that. And then also it ties into the personal piece too, right? That personal journey that people need to be taking, because I think once someone starts to understand that a little bit, then that will have an effect on how they actually work and have a better understanding of, maybe I shouldn't be talking about and telling people what their success should look like.
Right.
Or maybe I shouldn't be doing whatever, but it brings them to a level of questioning,
Right.
that I think is not necessarily happening too fast right now, because there's just this like idea that we're doing this good work for these people, but you know, it doesn't, for some reason, they don't have to think about it outside of 9 to 5.
Right.
The other piece that I think is very specific, because we've been running into this, and this has been a problem that we've faced with OIP over the last few years. And now I've actually been trying to support some of our past grantees moving on to newer, larger grants, is the charitable home, charitable mentor, qualified donee status craziness.
Right.
And
Right.
I don't know what the answer is, so I'm kind of just like putting that out there, because this is something that we have issue with every year, and trying to explain that too, of like what it actually means, and telling people very explicitly that these are the constraints that we're under in order to not be in trouble.
Right.
And so we're trying to figure out creative ways of getting around them, but we have to play this game so that, you know, we don't get charged or go to jail or whatever it means, you know, or we don't lose our charitable numbers, whatever that is. But it's like, it's one of those things that I'm like, this happens all the time and it stops people.
Absolutely.
And it's BS.
Agree. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, for many young people who, you know, I've supported, and you know, whether, you know, they have to now go find an organization and to receive the funding and act as a, you know, some people have called it a trustee, right? But I do like, you know, that sort of change of, you know, trustee, because it seems even the word trust within the word, you know, trustee is like, oh, this organization is seen to be better and more trustworthy, as opposed to a, let's say, a grassroots organization that has been doing work in community for such a long time, but they don't have that, you know, qualified charitable donee, like donee status that will allow for them to be receiving money for, you know, from the government or from different foundations or whatnot. And how do we move away from, you know, having to have that structure put in place, right? I have seen some unique sort of funding that have just been given onto individuals, but again, you know, there were still some requirements, whether people having to provide their SIN number, their bank statement, all that different stuff, but that's very few and far between. Then, you know, it acts as barriers for these young people who are doing stuff in their communities, taking money out of their, you know, bank accounts and all of that to do the work that they want to do. And then when the opportunity comes, there's this barrier of having to find an organization. And sometimes organizations take a 10% cut or a 5% cut, and all these different things. When I think like, hey, if you're a large organization, you don't need to take that percentage from a young person that's doing the work in their community. But I digress because this is not about me.
But this is something like, we give grants up to $5,000, and trying to find someone to accept that, and then they charge an administrative fees on top of that of $5,000.
Right.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
we're gonna delay young people having their. I mean, I hate it. I hate it. It drives me bananas, and I just wish that we could like figure out a better solution. But it's so incredibly frustrating, and I know that a lot of other organizations face this as well. And it was one of those things that came up quite a bit, even while I was working at the Circle, of like organizations calling, assuming that the Circle was a space that could happen, that could support in that way. And I think they did in some spaces, but it was just like the frustration that happens when like all of a sudden you realize that you can't just give them the funds that they worked for,
Yes.
they applied for, they spent that time, that they're not getting paid to apply, especially when you're applying for larger grants, when that shit takes you weeks, man. Like, you got to fill that out. You got to explain things so that people you don't know will understand what it is that you're talking about.
Right.
And, it's really frustrating.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm sure we can go on and on
Yeah.
on that. But as even my mom would say, I mean, with problems that's come with solutions and strategies. But perhaps you might even be able to talk about what positives have you seen in the philanthropic sector as it relates to engagement of Indigenous people in decision-making processes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the sector as a whole is starting to prioritize putting and including Indigenous people into these sort of roles and spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to give anybody shout outs for something they're supposed to do.
Absolutely.
So I'm not going to be like, you did so good because you have an Indigenous community, advisory team or whatever.
Right.
Like, you should do that anyways. But what I will say as a positive of a whole is that I do recognize that the sector as a whole versus a lot of different spaces is a lot quicker, I think, to adapt to and to understand even changes in language and to that sort of thinking. So it's like, while it's been taking quite a while to have putting Indigenous people, marginalized, racialized people into spaces of being in power and influence, that's starting to happen. But I think that there's other pieces too that, like, they're a lot, the sector seems to be a lot quicker to adapt to.
Mm-hmm.
So like we've, even a couple of years ago, I remember decolonize and decolonization as a word was the butt clenching word,
Mm-hmm.
And when people were like, oh no, I don't know, I don't think people understand what that means, and I don't know if I want to say that. And now it's like, it's everywhere.
Right.
Everybody's saying, it's like, well, this is decolonized and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, cool, okay, great. I'm glad you're comfy with it now. So
Right.
let's move on to white supremacist.
Right.
Say that one. But I just mean that as a very,
yes,
very top level, quick example of, like, I can appreciate that within this sector.
right. Awesome. Okay. So we want to dispel, societal myths about diverse folks in philanthropy. And so, what is one myth would you like to dispel about Indigenous folks in philanthropy?
So I think there's sort of one that I think I continue to see, and I've experienced, and that is when we invite Indigenous people into these spaces, let's say board, being a board member, whatever the space is, that there's this automatic assumption that they know everything about their culture, their community, their protocol, their ceremony. Right. And then B, that they're going to sit there and calmly explain things when you ask them questions.
Right. Yes.
And that's really frustrating because, like, did you not listen to what happened when the closing of the TRC happened? Like, there's been a destruction, there's been there's a lot of hurting that's happening and a lot of disconnection, and everybody's in their own spaces of reconnecting or not, but doing their best to try to understand where their parents and their grandparents are coming from. So it is unfair to assume that every single one of us knows everything about where we're from. Right. Like, I don't know my language, I don't know any of these things. And then to expect them to tell you everything about it and teach you so that you have that knowledge. And it's like, this knowledge is such a gift.
Right.
And it should be held on to. And then the other thing too is that, like, when you have the one like native person in the room, that they know about their culture and then also about everybody else's across Turtle Island, they're like, well, do you know what they do over, those Plains Indians? And it's like, I don't know. Right. There. I have no idea. So it's like, those are things that I think people really need to like consider, and those are things that we work on even within OIP, of like trying to acknowledge with our partners and our funders, of being like, maybe don't do that. Right. And if you want to talk about these things, or if you have questions and you're unsure of your language, and I'm sorry, my neighbor's dog, if you can hear that, but to ask us in our spaces, this week, we're hosting our partner meeting. And that's, we're going to be going over all of our decisions for the year, all of our learnings, and sharing that back so that we can provide a safer space for them to use language that they want to, and talk about some of these things so that they can start to implement those learnings into themselves as human beings attending it, also into their work. And so that's the other, like, tying right back to the beginning about like acting out on my, what I perceive as my role these days, of that's my way of protecting.
Right.
That's my way of trying to do some of that teaching so that, they don't have to worry about it, that the group of young people I work with don't have to think about that. And they don't have to worry about being exposed in any way or re-traumatized in any way by well-intentioned questions,
Right. So much pieces, and just sort of mind blowing, and the piece around, I think, again, when people invite to spaces, and expecting people to have knowledge of everything, and not realizing that within communities that people are diverse. And then beyond that, which I never really thought about, is the emotions, right? And sometimes when you come to the different tables, like, people just want to hear the gentle side of your views. Right? Provide us with the knowledge, provide us with how to do better, but not sit and listen of how we may be feeling about particular things that have happened within our community, and just allowing for that space for those emotions, raw emotions, to take, and not come off as the aggressive one.
Yeah. It's like, tell me in a calm manner, and do it so that I stay comfortable.
Yes.
Right? It's like,
yes.
Okay.
And that's not my role. I've had to.
No.
I've had to tell me, like, that's not my role. It is just about, if you want to get me at a table, you have to get me in all my like elements, and that is sometimes being very, very passionate. And I change that word of aggression to be passionate about what is happening in my community. And I know that we've said it before, but you know, probably in just sort of like closing and whatnot, and if there's any questions that people may have. I think some questions have been answered, but if there's anyone on the live that wants to ask any questions, we will come to you all shortly. But in terms of my sort of question is, you know, how can we plan for a future to ensure that more folks like us engage in philanthropy, both internally in the sector and externally in terms of giving back. And I know we've talked a lot about, you know, us being in the sector and receiving first, but what about even giving back, right? And how does that work?
Well, I think even how this sort of like conversation that we're having that came about is like a really great example of that. You know, Justin suggested that you talk to me because he was like, she's pretty cool and this might be a really great space. And I think I love that aspect of it, because I think within a lot of our communities, there's a lot of similarities in terms of how we place trust with people. And so now we've made this connection, you know, and like that's how we can uphold each other and we can support each other within the sector and continue to push each other forward as well. I've always thinking about inviting each other to spaces and supporting the work and thinking about those things. You know, I really appreciate that Justin thought about me to do this, and I'm so happy because now I know you and I'm freaking stoked about it, you know. Yes. So I mean, I see sort of that, but then that trickles into our families and our other spaces and our networks, you know. I don't really know if this is going to show on my Facebook, but I know that, like, I don't know how this works. Totally honest, I have no idea what's going on. It's magic. But like how that can, like, when other people can start to see how it is that we're maybe changing the game a little bit and how we're changing our language and communicating a little bit, is it can be really inspiring and fun and be like, wow, maybe I need to like listen to this a little bit more and take part in that. And maybe I want to apply for an OIP grant and maybe I want to do this. And making a space that's open enough that people can respond and relate and reach out, I think is just like, I don't know. I don't even know if that made sense. Sorry.
No, definitely. It definitely it makes sense. And it's all about, you know, I think, again, like, you know, all these words and whatnot, but because I always think of, when I think of like, you know, like philanthropy, right? And all this and different things. And when it comes down to the basic, it's like how you want to communicate and interact. Like, you know, just even hearing people think of like philanthropy as like a science, right? Like, you know, respond to a donor within, you know, 48 hours, right? Because there's a science behind response rates. And I was like, what? Like, like at the basis of everything is connections and relationships, right? And so kind of touching in what you're saying, right? That we use words like allyship and all these things, but it comes down to relationships, right? And how you treat people. And I also heard this one saying, and I, you know, and I love it, which is, you know, treat others as you want you treat them, right? So they want you to treat them how they want to be treated, not the other way, as, you know, treat yourself as you would like yourself be treated, because some people don't even treat themselves well, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's really about, again, relationships. And, you know, when you say about us making the connections, making the relationships, you and I have made this connections. You know, some people on this like chat might have more sort of questions coming out, right? That we want to ensure that people are starting to change the way. I think I have learned a lot just from this conversation, right? Of you know, how can I even support, well, one, myself in terms of challenging like white supremacy, right? And then also in terms, how do I get young people to also challenge that, right? And to be okay to be that one who would be the, for the lack of shit disturber, but I'm okay with that, right? And ensuring that others have that sense of confidence to do that piece. So I mean, of course, as I said, I'm just humble and thankful that you took the time to have this sort of conversation. I'm going to open it up to anyone on the live if they wanted to ask a question. I think we are about right on time, about 6 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, this is the time. I saw just okay. I have Audrey just said, thank you both for creating this amazing opportunity to embark on a journey that can make a difference in shifting the mindset of individuals. Thank you, Audrey, for that. Anthony said, such a great conversation. I think you've left a lot of us with things to think about. Then questions. Thea, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we end off?
I really appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate everybody that's watching, and I'd love to kind of continue having some of these conversations too. So I'm so happy that we're connected now. Yes. And I look forward to kind of figuring out where we can fit in together a little bit in the future. And I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Well, you gave a lot. When you say you have that, a lot was given, and I again appreciate it. Just so that everybody knows, the conversation will be posted on this group page. It is a public group group, but people have to request to join the group, and so continue to have the conversations. If there's any comments, more people saying thanks for hosting, so thank you, Jaya, for coming on board, and Shireen, she said you rock. Justin just put lots of hearts, which I'm assuming, Thea, you're amazing. And so and Ronit, who is our project coordinator for the fellowship, she said this was wonderful. So thank you, everyone, and feel free again to keep the conversation going. Awesome. So
great.
Bye.
Miigwech. Bye.